Okay, so this vodcast is going to be about exploring some of the philosophical ideas that underpin the outsider, specifically for our Year 11 class, creating and presenting, drawing on that. It's tricky to understand the outsider without getting some of these core ideas. So we're just going to be chatting about this. Mr. Symons and
Miss Rao.
Fantastic. We're just, going to be chatting through them. So, we'll kick it off with ideas of libertarianism, determinism, and compatibilism.
Which is a really hard word to say. I think almost more important than looking at the philosophical ideas is sort of actually exploring it through questions. So just having a look at the PowerPoint right now, our key question is this idea of, do we have free will? And for those of you out there who haven't really thought about free will, it's basically your capacity to make choices and your ability to do what you actually want to do. So philosophers over time have examined this question, and they've come up, there are these three theories that allow us to explore whether or not we actually have the choices. So I guess let's start with libertarianism. Mr. Symons, what is libertarianism?
I guess libertarianism is the idea that, from my understanding, it's more of an assertion than it is an argument. Arguments are usually well crafted and based on logic, whereas libertarianism, from my understanding, simply seems to be the assertion that human beings have free will, that we are able to make choices. Some have phrased the question in the way that we will choose one thing, but do we have the ability to choose the other options? So libertarianism would say that, yes, if you have the choice of 5 different things in front of you, it's purely up to your will. I think the word will is operative there, as to which one of those things you will take at any given time.
Yeah. So I guess if we were to put it into a practical context, I suppose it's to do with choices. And as students about to finish school and enter into university, the concept of libertarianism would be about, okay, what choices do you have when you actually decide on your post-compulsory schooling pathways? So as students of this school, one could say that you have unlimited a number of choices because you are potentially able to pay for your education for post-compulsory. You have access to education that allows you to enter the pathway of university. And really it's up to you whether or not you go to uni or what course you actually pick. Whereas in other philosophical arguments would suggest that not everyone does have that choice, that some of the external factors influence whether or not they are going to do what they want to do.
Yes, exactly. And not only the choice about which university and which course, but also all of the choices that lead up to that point.
Yeah.
So whether or not I'll do homework tonight, or whether or not I will do maths instead of accounting. So a libertarianist would say at each given moment we make a conscious choice about what we will or will not do.
And does that concept of choice have to do with control as well, in terms of what we're able to control and what we are not able to control? So libertarianism suggests that we have control over the choices that we are making. Whether or not that's real is questionable, but that's what they would, that's the assumption being made.
Yes, yep, exactly.
Yeah. So in contrast, I suppose, determinism suggests that we don't have control at all. And that's also related to choice, that we don't have control over our genes and our experiences are dictated by genes. Is that right? To some extent?
To some extent, yeah. So we have our genes and we have our makeup of who we are as a person. And then we also have the other factor in our choices is our experiences. So this relies on the fact that there's only really these 2 factors which influence which way we go, either way. So when you look at these 2 things, so you don't actually choose your makeup as a person. You don't get to kind of sift through all the potential DNA and choose the particular things. even if, like, I'm just thinking, even in Gattaca, where the parents get to choose, the person who they're choosing, so to speak, doesn't get to choose.
No. Because they have no capacity to choose because they're not born yet.
They're not born yet.
Yeah,
yes, there's
exactly.
no agency there. There's no being, so to speak. And the next one's a little bit trickier, but should be still quite apparent. We have experiences, and they affect what we choose to do later and don't choose to do later. So they also go all the way back to our birth.
Yeah.
And all the experiences that we have from birth aren't necessarily our choice either.
Yeah,
so
because they're determined by your environment, aren't they? I
exactly.
mean, if we go back to that schooling example, for people at this school, there's certainly a sort of environment that allows them to make choices about their future, so-called choices, but other kids don't have that their environment is completely different. So statistically, the kids who actually go to universities, as some of the students in my class might remember, are generally the upper and middle class students. And I think there's only about 17% of students from a lower socioeconomic background who actually enter university.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's quite significant, isn't it? And that is really because of the environment they've been brought up in, and to some extent, their pathways are determined by that environment more so than people in this particular socioeconomic background, that these students who attend this school. Yeah.
So that's a lovely example, and it works nicely for the libertarianist perspective as well. Let's explore that. Some might say that, so I go through high school, I discover that I have a real passion for engineering.
Yeah.
I don't, that's horrible. But let's say...
We'll assume that you loved maths.
That's
and
right.
I think it's physics that you also have to enjoy for engineering.
Yay.
Yeah, two faves.
Yes, exactly. Now, you might say that I made the choice to enjoy engineering, but there's a whole bunch of things that I didn't choose which have led to my enjoyment of engineering. Teachers that I've had in the past, the input that I've had from parents, my previous success in those subjects, which leads all the way back.
And even exposure to this career pathway, exposure to engineering as something that you actually want to do is basically based on your environment, isn't it? And where you've grown up, who you've grown up around, and your parents might have known other engineers or might have had those connections that allow you to make that kind of decision for yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if my parents had not had any interaction with engineers, that also affects my choice.
Yeah.
Because I can idealise that particular pathway. If I don't have any concrete experience of it in my life, then I'm going on what I imagine it to be, which isn't necessarily what it is, but that's my experience and that's what I go on. So it's interesting. The determinist says that there are only really two factors in why you make certain decisions. One of those is who you are as a person innately, your inherent nature, which is
to do with your genes. Yes.
DNA.
Yep.
And the experiences that you've been the recipient of in your life, hearkening all the way back to your birth.
Yep.
So your genetics and your experience actually cause you, it's a causal relationship between the two, cause you to choose.
Yep.
And you can't make any choice that doesn't comply with your genetics and your experiences together. You try and imagine a choice that you might make where you choose other than your genetics and your experience. It seems to be an absurd thing.
Yeah. And of course, basically the argument would go that you could trace back any choice that you do make to your genes and your experience. So you can't escape it, hence the word determinism or determined. It's already kind of sorted out for you.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it's funny. I mean, it's something we don't like thinking about. It's something that's kind of a little bit harrowing when we realise that every choice that we ever make is actually already predetermined. And we might rail against it a little bit, and the arguments that tend to come up against it are these, no, but but I do choose. You know, my mind is active in my choices. But the determinists will simply say, that's the illusion of free will.
Yeah.
You feel like you're choosing, but actually you're just complying with your genetic makeup and your experience. You actually can't choose anything else. And I think the way they phrase it is, with all, say, 5 different options, you end up choosing one of those options. You could not have possibly chosen the other 4. You had no potential means of going for those other 4 because of your previous experience in your genetics.
Yeah, that it would always be that one particular choice that you make. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, on a kind of side note, the whole concept of choice and having choices is so modern. I mean,
Right.
if you think back to, a couple of 100 years ago, really, there was a sort of version of determinism out there, but it was very much dictated by what God wanted, and a sort of religion actually decided the pathways that you would have in life. And really, we look at it in terms of determinism, but I suppose that concept itself has been around for ages. That fate or destiny, which is really much more connected with, I suppose, a higher being, has been around for a long time.
Yeah. Like all the great ancient Greek plays. Tragedy. And
where they can't escape what happens to them, because what is meant to happen, as some of you might remember from Oedipus, what's meant to happen is that Oedipus is going to marry his mother and kill his father, and no matter what he does, that is what will happen.
Yeah. And that's actually a really lovely example. And in that example, it's the gods who make that determination.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And in our current understanding of determinism, it's our genetics
it's
and our experience.
Yeah, we're bringing science into it.
Exactly. So, logically and scientifically, we actually have no way of choosing. So science has become the new version of, and far more harrowing and, I think, probably more logical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I suppose we should talk about the last one, compatibilism.
Yes.
I find this one probably the most confusing to get my head around.
It's tricky. Yeah.
It's very confusing, and not just because every time I see that word, I think of cannibalism. And they are both unrelated. So those of you listening to it out there, compatibilism, nothing to do with cannibalism.
Unless you choose to eat another person, in which case, they work.
You could make it work.
Okay,
you could make it work. But let's try and not think about that, because I don't want to confuse anyone. So what exactly is compatibilism?
I think it's a good word to use if we look at the previous 2 terms. Compatibilism is called that because it marries libertarianism with determinism. It shows that actually there's no distinction. There is a distinction, but there's no conflict between the 2. So libertarianism exists, we do have free will, but actually the free will that we have is determined, which seems a little bit ridiculous until you put it into context. So compatibilism starts off with the logical deterministic view that our choices are determined. We actually have no ability to choose other than what we will choose.
Yeah.
But compatibilism says we still actually want the thing that we choose. So in our example before about engineering, the person who chooses the engineering degree, they could not have chosen otherwise. Because of their life circumstances, because of their experiences in the past, and because of who they are as a person, they want to be an engineer. They could not have chosen to be a journalist. They could not have even chosen to be, say, a mathematician, an academic mathematician. But they still want to be an engineer. They still actually want that thing. So they have free will, but they could not have chosen anything else.
Yes. And that's, I suppose, makes them, they're reconciled almost to the choices they think they are making.
Yes.
But I guess on some level, compatibilism suggests that that the sense that we think choices are actually real is not.
Yes.
That it's actually an illusion. And we think that we want things, but really they were determined already.
Right.
Is that kind of what it's saying?
Exactly right. Yeah. So this is saying that to have free will, we don't have to have the ability to choose other than what we will choose.
We don't need to have 5 different choices.
Yes.
We just need to have
The one.
The one, which makes it less of a choice.
Right.
But ultimately, we still think that we have a choice.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's playing with language a little bit, but yeah, in that context of vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry ice cream,
Yes.
I'm going to pick chocolate. I can't choose strawberry. I can't choose vanilla. But I still want chocolate.
Yeah.
I want the thing that I
And it doesn't
have to
bother you
choose.
that you're having chocolate. You don't feel like you
Exactly.
don't have choices because really you've already accepted that that's actually what you want.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Cool. So I think that covers that
Yeah.
pretty well.
How would we bring this back now to the outsider? So the students obviously know that they need to discuss external ideas. And while these 3 ideas don't necessarily directly relate to how Mousseau lives his life, I guess they do relate to some extent to absurdism.
Yep.
So how would we do that?
Okay, cool. So the next slide we've got here, it's important to realise, so like a lot of people would say, I think, that Camus didn't like the term existentialism to describe his own philosophy.
Yeah.
He recognised its validity, and he acknowledged it as being, it's very much a Kierkegaard, so I've forgotten his first name. Anyway.
It really doesn't matter. Let's make one up.
Okay. Seamus Kierkegaard or Jean-Paul Sartre, that they are existentialist philosophers.
Yes.
Nietzsche could also be said to be an existentialist philosopher.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Friedrich, lovely German word. Not that I'm very good at pronouncing it, but I enjoy pronouncing it. They're existentialists. Yeah.
Yes. And so I suppose before we move on,
Yeah.
existentialism is essentially a philosophical idea that requires people to question the meaning of life.
Yes.
Yeah, and to focus on that as almost their duty or responsibility as human beings, that we are here to figure out why we're here.
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly right. And then act out a life which pursues that goal.
Yes.
So these guys would say that, so it's a beautiful quote here by Sartre, in life man commits himself and draws his own portrait, outside of which there is nothing. So you can't escape your subjectivity. You are locked inside the shell of your body, and you construct the reality that takes place.
That you want to take place.
And who you are as well inside that.
So your reality that you construct is really a reflection of your personality, who you are, and what you want to be as well, to some extent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it starts with also the premise that there's no objective meaning to life. There's no... so if God is dead, there's no theistic being dictating to us that there is a certain meaning in life.
Yeah.
Then if that's out of the equation, as Nietzsche said, God is dead.
Yes.
So now we get to ask the real question is, what do we want life to be? And so then Sartre would say you have incredible, so he's a libertarianist, he would say you have incredible free will, go out and make yourself, go out and build yourself and draw your own portrait as such.
And I guess compared to what we see with Mousseau and Camus, that's quite a positive look on life, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean, believing that you have the capacity to do what you want to do and that everything is really up to you is very freeing. And I think one of the challenges my students have faced with The Outsider is the sense that the way Mousseau lives his life seems so constraining and almost in itself meaningless. Why continue to live on in the way that he does? What's the point of it all, you know? And it's a very frustrating thing to try and understand. But and this is much more convincing, isn't it? Not just because of the picture of wonderful autumnal trees,
Right.
but actually just in terms of this is a much more, I suppose, convincing argument just for the sense, just because it allows us to do what we want to do and gives us free reign.
Yeah, it feels good,
It
doesn't
does
it?
feel good. It's very optimistic.
It's beautifully buoyant.
It is.
But I think Camus would say that Sartre's fooling himself.
Yes. And I would say that, I mean, I'm not as familiar with Sartre and even Camus as I am with Nietzsche, and I'd say that even Nietzsche would say that Sartre is fooling himself. That
Yes.
He's this is an illusion. But what he's saying is essentially something to comfort himself so he can wake up every morning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I can imagine Sartre saying, shh, just be quiet.
Don't destroy my illusion.
I like my illusion.
Exactly.
Just, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's, I guess, the relationship between libertarianism and existentialism. Existentialism requires libertarianism. If you can't choose meaning in your own life, then there's no point in being an existentialist, which is the whole point.
The whole point.
Yeah, is
being able to choose
meaning.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then we come to, I guess here's the rub. This is where compatibilism meets absurdism. And in fact, absurdism it kind of flows out of compatibilism. Mm-hmm. And we can see that in two of Camus' texts, The Outsider and the Myth of Sisyphus.
Now, before we get on to that, something that was just annoying me before is there seems to be, as far as I can see it, a clear difference between existentialism and absurdism. So why is it that people do still connect Camus with existentialism? I mean, it might just be a popular media thing and people who maybe haven't read into it as much, but certainly in public discourse about The Outsider and about Camus, there is a sense that he is an existentialist. So why is that, do you think?
It's tricky. I don't know the answer, but I see it, and it's not just, I think, popular media as well. It's academics also read The Outsider with an existentialist lens.
Yeah.
So there's got to be some validity there, doesn't it, to that reading. Maybe it's because we like umbrella terms.
Yeah.
Maybe we like things to fit into certain categories.
And certainly in terms of the era in which Camus was writing is the period where existentialism had its highs.
Exactly.
One of its highs.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's easy to see when you read The Outsider. I mean, you were expressing yourself this frustration that we have with the character of Mousseau.
Yeah.
That he's not in charge.
No.
He is.
He
acknowledges.
Really
does, absolutely.
He's so on the opposite end of that spectrum that he just drifts through life, and there's a sense that all of the so-called decisions that he's made are so-called by people in the community, but he himself bears so little relationship with his choices, or
exactly,
decisions.
Yes.
Even just that simple moment of shooting the Arab, there's just no sense that he even has control over his bodily functions or to pull that trigger. It just happens.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned in your last podcast that the language itself conveys this disconnect between what Mousseau's thinking and what his body seems to be doing. And there's a sense that things are happening to him, even though it's not about him, it's about this poor Arab who gets shot.
Absolutely, yeah. And then he immediately accepts responsibility. Yeah. He says something like, I have ruined the day. He witnesses the beauty of the environment, the balance of the day, beautifully said. Yeah. And he says, I have done that. So he doesn't try and escape it.
No.
Doesn't try and handball responsibility for his actions. He says, it's all happened outside my control, but I'm also responsible for what I've done.
What I've done. And that's almost one of the most frustrating things about the text, because you look at Mousseau and on some level we can't avoid feeling sympathy for him.
Yes.
At the trial, when that final verdict's sent out, we want to say, no, he should be saved, but he's done the wrong thing. But we still want to say that.
Yeah.
And I think Camus has done that on purpose. I think we're supposed to have that reaction, that we're supposed to feel a little bit torn about what we know to be the right and wrong of this situation and our genuine desire for something better in terms of what happens to Mousseau. It's just too hard to walk away and think that's the end.
Exactly.
That this is all that it's been.
Yeah, exactly.
We're definitely moving
and then
from the point.
We're allowed.
We
Do what I want. Which is what makes that. Look, I think when he finishes, and we're probably to relate it to the myth of Sisyphus here. When he finishes, he's done shouting at the priest for offering to pray for him.
Yeah.
He's
One of my favourite scenes.
It's kind of, I kind of find it hilarious. He's done that. it's this beautiful catharsis of emotion. He's got all out, and then he reflects and he says something which is baffling in some ways, but worth our thought, worth dwelling on. He says, when I've considered everything and I look back at my life, I realised I'd been happy. And I realised that I am happy.
Yes.
So despite all of the injustice that he's suffered, that's our perception, despite all of the meaninglessness of walking around his apartment, despite...
And the drudgery of being in jail,
drudgery is the
which
best word
in
for
many ways is not dissimilar to his life in the apartment as well.
Yes, exactly.
There's a sort of prison. His apartment is also, in a way, a prison, which allows him to stay away from the outside world.
Yeah, exactly. And
But he is happy.
Declares himself happy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even when he shoots the Arab, he mentions with the same thing about losing the balance of the day, that where he had been so happy, he actually explicitly says that he'd been so happy. And yet, where is that indication when he's telling us the story? We get no sense of his joy or his pleasure in what he's doing. But beyond the aesthetic, and I was talking to my students about the aesthetic in class recently, about how yes, Mousseau doesn't seem to be involved with pretty much anything, but he does have this bizarre appreciation of aesthetic beauty, and everything is, and that's why it's such a descriptive text. And you know, Camus goes into painstaking detail about everything that's in the room, or every single moment when he's with Marie is about her physical beauty, and there is a real appreciation coming from Mousseau for that beauty.
Absolutely.
And that's what keeps him going. And that's my reading. That's what's because I had to find a reason. I couldn't let it go. I'm sorry, Camus. But that's my reason for what keeps him going, that he is able to see some value, even if it is just on a day-to-day basis. He's able to see some beauty that allows him to continue with his life. And an article I was reading actually did link that to the absurd, that absurdism does say that yes, there's no meaning in life, and our problem is that we're constantly hoping for things that are better, and we expect more, and we want all of these things, but even if they happen, it's not going to make us happy, essentially. Like nothing really is going to satisfy us. That's never going to be reached. And the article I was reading positioned it in such a way that characters like Mousseau show us that what is important is, first of all, and this is very oversimplified, but what is important is being true to yourself and being, and he called it integrity, and it's all about integrity. And integrity is something that's valued higher than morality, because integrity is something that you can actually control, that you have a choice to be true and honest about who you are, and that's something that we should value and care about. And that and the aesthetics is what should matter to us, basically.
And you get that through the prose of the short story too. I mean, you look at the things that the beautiful parts of Camus' writing is in his description of the aesthetic. And the drab part of his writing, which is no less valuable, it's still important and still conveys his meaning, is the day-to-day. And it's a discussion about ideas, where he often says, anyway, you know, it's this dismissive word, anyway. Anyway.
It's very conversational, isn't it?
Right, not that it matters, you know. So he dismisses things that we would commonly regard as important, like ideas. And he appreciates things that we might overlook, reminded of gather ye rosebuds while you may, you know.
Seize the day, carpe diem, Dead Poets Society.
I think it's Byron, isn't it? Yeah, beautiful. And I think, I don't know, I kind of get the impression that Camus would just have us stop thinking so much, which is a bit ironic considering we're thinking a lot about Camus.
Well, it is highly ironic, isn't it? I mean, here we are with Mousseau, who is thinking about the mundane almost all of the time.
Yes.
And yet we're using his thought processes to build an analysis about wider ideas to do with the meaning of life.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
It's massively ironic.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
I'm sure Camus, wherever he is laughing in his
Right.
heavenly
Okay, so
seat,
this marries
potentially.
beautifully. Right near the end, there's this commentary about how every man is privileged. This is Meso talking to the other characters, or thinking about the other characters. He doesn't say much, actually, but he says, everyone's privileged. Doesn't he understand? Everyone's privileged. And then almost immediately after he says everyone's condemned. So it's this idea that, I think I described it to my students in that everyone's condemned to death.
Yes.
I think in my class I looked around and I
Death and taxes.
spoke to every person and I said, you're sentenced to death, and you're sentenced to death, and you're sentenced to death. You know, we're all sentenced to death. We can't escape that.
No.
We should probably stop worrying about it.
Yeah.
But we're all privileged. We should actually be concerned with the idea that we're privileged.
We're privileged in the sense that we're alive.
Yes.
Yes.
And we have access to the aesthetic.
Yes.
And we have a window of consciousness in eternity. So I think he might say, our experience, or our window of consciousness is so valuable that upward mobility, or the seeking for more,
To gain power.
to gain power,
To have more power. Look at that, a link
lovely.
to the context.
Nice, well done.
Thank you.
To climb the corporate ladder, to
go up the social hierarchy, to have more money,
Right.
to have more goods, to whatever it is that more cultural capital.
yeah.
All of it's pointless.
Right. And how sad are those people who do it, rather than appreciating what's available to them in each moment. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think that's potently shown through... so the myth of Sisyphus is actually an essay written by Camus.
Yeah.
And the parallels between the myth of Sisyphus and the outsider are just fantastic. But it's most potently shown, I think, through the close and the ending, where Sisyphus's response to being locked into this
Eternal
yes,
damnation.
exactly,
Really.
yeah,
For anyone else, it would be.
right.
Rolling a rock up a hill.
Oh man, that sounds terrible. Just pushing this rock, as you can see there. His response is, well, I'm going to fool the gods again. I'm going to, you've locked me into this. You've condemned me, if we want to use the words of the outsider. You've condemned me to this futile exercise.
Yes.
Well, stuff you. I'm going to enjoy it.
Going back to choice, is that the only choice that we have, according to, say, Camus?
Right.
That our choice is essentially our reaction to these sorts of situations, that everything is a bit rubbish. If you're Sisyphus, it's more so.
Yes.
But we have a choice in terms of what we're going to, or how we're going to see things, and how we're going to see the world.
Yes.
So for Sisyphus, the only choice that he had was, well, he could have just grumbled his life away, or he could have just learned to actually accept and even be happy about rolling the rock.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that's really good reading.
And certainly even Musso, to some extent, expresses that sort of line where he comments on his ability to adapt to anything, essentially.
Yeah.
He's in jail, and he describes how being in prison was very difficult, and especially the evenings, and he doesn't like to write about it, but he does, of course. And he does say that you can get used to pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And there's a sense that that's true, that you can get used to anything, because you can decide that you're going to get used to anything.
Right.
Instead of railing against it, you can accept and adapt and potentially even enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it becomes a home for him, the same way that his apartment was, except
Right.
he can't go to the beach.
Yeah.
But even that he doesn't miss anymore, because he lives in his memories.
Yeah. Which works nicely with his reflections on his mother's transition as well.
Yes.
So his mother goes out, cries for some time when she's put in the home, but then she gets used to it. And in fact, she forms some really nice bonds there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really works. I think the aesthetic of Sisyphus as well, I think in the description that Camus has of that moment, he's appreciating not necessarily the meaning behind of what he's doing,
No.
but how it feels.
Yes.
The push of the rock on his hands, the effort needed to exercise one's strength, and the feeling of satisfaction when the boulder's got to the top of the hill and he's seeing it roll down again.
Yes.
So it is very much the aesthetic
Yeah.
into play there as well.
Yeah, and I think we've discussed this before, but from a more modern context, you look at things that people are willing to put themselves through because they
Right.
enjoy that sense of power, I think,
Yeah.
to some extent, that is involved in something that some other people might consider physically quite challenging.
Yep.
Perfect example being sport, of course. I mean, if I was asked to go run a mile or, play football, I would be in writhing in agony.
That's a great comparison, actually.
But
yeah.
ultimately, there is a satisfaction that people get, and you see it in the face of football players when they are running around out there or when they're fighting each other or whatever it might be.
Yes.
There is just this level of satisfaction that comes from the exercise of physical power, which I
Yeah.
suppose is the aesthetic in that context, because they certainly don't look beautiful as they're doing it, depending on what sport
Oh,
you're
no,
talking about.
stubby shorts are pretty hot.
No comment there. We may need to edit that out.
Okay. Yeah, good. That's really cool. I think that kind of works. So Sisyphus, like Camus, then no one has any choice over where they die,
Yeah.
how they're going to die, or how long they've got to live,
Yep.
or all that kind of jazz.
Yep.
We've really, and that differentiation that you pointed out before, I think is I'm just kind of going on the fly here, so is a really critical one. So it's not that we necessarily have no free will in our ability to choose, but we have free will in our ability to perceive.
Yes.
So it's actually a cognitive thing as opposed to an action thing.
Yeah.
We have no control over our actions. We have control over our
Reactions.
perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Cool. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Not so much, no. I think we've sort of discussed what's on the slide. I think we've talked around the edges of it.
Yeah.
I guess just to give the listeners out there a bit of an overview, we've looked at all these different theories basically to explore two big questions, and that is, firstly, do we have free will? So do we have the capacity to choose? And the second question being, what is the actual meaning of life? In terms of the outsider, the focus is very much more on the second question, I'd say. What is the meaning of life? Is there actually meaning? And that follows on with Camus' own interest in absurdism and focusing on the idea that we don't have any meaning in our lives.
Yes.
Whereas some of the other ideas definitely focus much more on our capacity to choose what we do with our lives, and the focus being that there is meaning,
Yes.
and we get to choose what that is.
Right. That's
So
good.
Would that be sort of the two schools of thought on this?
Yes,
would you
I like
say?
it. I like it.
Can we
Yeah.
divide it up in that way?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really good. And I think what I'll be looking for in my students' work is some kind of conveying, if we're relating it to power and authority, which is our context, some kind of way of showing that Camus acknowledges that the pursuit of power and the pursuit of authority are not valid answers to this question of
No.
what is the meaning of life.
Yeah.
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 So rather than that appreciation of the aesthetic
Yeah.
is a
more
correct
meaningful.
response. More
Yeah.
meaningful.
Yeah. And certainly the pursuit of power is something that's validated by the members of this society, but we are, as always, on Mousseau's side. And just in case you haven't figured it out, Mousseau is Camus'
Yes.
mouthpiece.
Yes.
So therefore we must be on Mousseau and Camus' side for this discussion.
Yep. We must imagine him happy.
We must.
Yes.
Indeed. There's no evidence to the contrary either. Hope you're listening, people in my class.
Yep.
Okay, so
Cool.
I think that wraps it up.
Okay. Thanks for listening. If I can find the pause button.